But first, another day, another attack on Australian Jews. But this morning's attack was different, more sinister. A Melbourne synagogue set on fire while Jewish worshippers were inside. Thank God no one was seriously injured or worse. Anyone surprised by this morning's firebombing of a synagogue hasn't been paying attention. It was inevitable that things would get to this point, and it's outrageous that they've been allowed to. A point well made by fed-up members of the community who hectored Labor Premier Jacinta Allen at a press conference this morning.
There will be increased police patrols, increased police presence on the streets. They'll be around synagogues, they'll be around important places for the Jewish community, united to resoundingly condemn.
But why should
Sorry, Abby, can I just ask a quick question? Jacinta, you mentioned that you're going to increase police patrols.
No, the Victoria Police.
And you're going to increase your presence. Is that not a sign that you've lost control in this state and the Jewish community are now under real threat and that your government has ultimately failed? So let's stop with the politics and let's get a short, sharp, straight answer. Have you lost control? Have you lost control, yes or no?
I will take the advice from the Victoria Police and the Chief Commissioner, who advises me that in terms of acts of violence, they have the tools and the powers to investigate and prosecute people. It would be deeply inappropriate. It would be deeply
politics, and this is the comment.
I can understand his frustration. It's not that Labor has lost control. Labor never had control. And shamefully, they've never made a serious attempt to control anti-Semitism at all. On October 7 last year, a horde of bloodthirsty terrorists swarmed into Israel and slaughtered 1,200 Israelis in cold blood, with polls consistently showing a majority of the Gaza population supporting the attack. They killed men, women, children. They killed babies. Then Hamas operatives, including some in the employ of a UN relief agency, ran back to Gaza where they celebrated and showed off the 254 hostages they'd collected as trophies. Their loot included Israeli babies. And the world was outraged for about 5 minutes. You'll remember here in Sydney that the state government decided to light up the Opera House in the colours of the Israeli flag. That was an appropriate gesture to show love and support for Jewish Australians who personally knew many of the families killed in that horrendous terrorist attack, the worst loss of Jewish lives in a single day since the Holocaust. And you'll remember, shamefully, what happened. No sooner had the Opera House sails been lit up for Israel than an angry mob brandishing flares and Palestinian flags gathered to chant what I heard as "Gas the Jews." Although New South Wales Police later told me that what I'd actually heard was the mob say, "Where are the Jews?" which was apparently just a polite inquiry rather than a threat. And if you believe that, you'll believe anything. Well, you want to know where the Jews were that night? They were locked inside their Sydney homes on advice of New South Wales Police. Authorities advised them it wasn't safe to venture down to the Opera House in their own city to view the sails lit up for them. A show of compassion and empathy for Jewish Australians was hijacked in ugly scenes that were broadcast around the world. And from that moment until now, it's been one attack against Jewish Australians after another. And why would we be surprised? Here's something you need to understand. Whatever you tolerate becomes the norm. And our government, our police, our university vice-chancellors, sections of our arts and media, they've tolerated a lot that ought never have been tolerated. Islamic preachers in Western Sydney celebrated the mass attack on Israel and called for more jihad. Somehow their rhetoric, referring to Jews as pigs and monkeys, never quite reached the level of hate speech. Curiously, though, our politicians couldn't quite explain why, or at least not well enough. Call a biological man wearing a dress a man, and you'll be in all sorts of trouble in this country. But stand up in a mosque in Western Sydney and preach that Australian Jews are swine, and state premiers will be wringing their hands saying, "Oh, it doesn't meet the threshold where we can do anything about it." And for some reason, many of the Islamic organisations in this country that always insist they're about tolerance and respect never quite get around to condemning their colleagues' remarks. The West is caught in a deadly pincer movement right now when it comes to the spread of Islam. Islamic extremists say the most outrageous things right before Islamic moderates warn that we mustn't succumb to Islamophobia. And so with most people afraid to say anything about the extremists for fear of being branded Islamophobic by the moderates, the extremists are emboldened to carry on as the moderates watch approvingly from the sidelines. It's a pretty sweet arrangement. And the Albanese government, who are either nefarious or clueless, I honestly haven't worked out which yet, play into this every time they react to anti-Semitism by warning about Islamophobia. And the rest of us are left to wonder what the hell has happened to our country. Within weeks of 1,200 Jews being slaughtered, there were marches in our streets, not in solidarity with grieving Jews, but in support of terrorist-ruled Gaza. The marches have continued week after week and still continue more than a year later. The boss of ASIO, no less, described the marches as, and I quote, an important pressure release valve. Labor MP Michelle Ananda Raja said the Director General of our Secret Service, Mike Burgess, told her, and I quote, I can live with a protest provided it's respectful, but not with terrorism. Well, Mr Burgess, now you've got protests and terrorism. What's the firebombing of a Jewish synagogues while Jews are worshipping inside other than an act of domestic terrorism? It makes you wonder if our ASIO boss has ever been to a pro-Palestinian protest. I have. I've been to a few in Sydney and in Melbourne. And I can tell you from first-hand experience they are anything but respectful. And they're most certainly not an important pressure release valve. They're a hotbed of anti-Semitism and an obvious breeding ground for extremists. But the protests have been allowed to go on week after week. They've become as normal in our CBD as bike lanes. And how has this been allowed to happen? My grandfather passed away in the 90s, but if you told him then that this would be Australia in 2024, he would never have believed you, not in a million years. Many protesters dress in the same garb as the Hamas terrorists, wave flags in support of designated terror organisations, and hold up portraits in honour of terrorist leaders. Pressure release valve my arse. That the people charged with keeping Australia safe spin this as a good way to ensure things don't get worse beggars belief and only serves to endanger us all. Let me say again, whatever you tolerate, you get more of. That's why time doesn't permit me to talk about Jewish people being pushed in the street or about posters of Jewish hostages being vandalised with faeces, or about Jewish shopfronts being vandalised, or about Jewish students and staff being harassed on their own university campuses, or about Jewish performers being boycotted, or about Jewish school children being bullied, or about Jewish business people being doxxed, or about Jewish mums and dads trying to explain to their kids why they shouldn't advertise the fact that they're Jews in Australia. I host a program here on Sky News Monday to Thursday called The Late Debate. Do you know, some nights when we're deciding what we will talk about on our show, we wonder if we should talk about that particular day's episode of anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism's become so common in this country now it's hardly news anymore. I can't believe I'm actually saying that. I'm going to get into the events of this morning with my guests in a moment, and Shari Markson is waiting. But before I do, can I just point out one more thing? This morning's arson attack came just hours after Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned our government that something like this, or worse, would occur. The Albanese government is insisting on a Palestinian state while Hamas terrorists still hold more than 100 hostages, while Hamas are still sworn to the eradication of Israel, and while the Palestinian Authority still refuses to condemn the actions of Hamas. Netanyahu pointed out what should be the bleeding obvious when he said, awarding anti-Semitism and terrorism with a state in the heart of the Jewish ancient homeland and cradle of civilization will invite more terrorism and more anti-Semitic riots at campuses and city centres, including Australia. Netanyahu is absolutely correct. But do you know what the Albanese government thinks of the Israeli leader? They say they'd be obligated to arrest Netanyahu for war crimes if he ever set foot in this country. Well, you're not a war crime when you're trying to rescue your family's women and children from the hands of Hamas sexual predators. Penny Wong's tweet in response to this morning's attack on Australian Jews is worth nothing. She tweeted, I condemn unequivocally the Melbourne Synagogue attack. The targeting of a place of worship is an act of hate. Violence and anti-Semitism have no place in Australia, blah, blah, blah. Penny Wong's immoral Middle East policy, which is nothing more or less than insisting that a democratic state negotiates with terrorists as equals, has given place to violence and anti-Semitism in Australia. You can't equivocate on terrorism and then act shocked when you end up with terrorism. The sooner this Labor government is gone, the sooner Australian Jews, not to mention the rest of us, will feel safe again. Albanese and Wong sit in Canberra moralising from the cheap seat 17,000 kilometres away about how an ally surrounded by enemies ought to behave. If Penny Wong thinks Israel's doing such a bad job, she can always get on a Qantas plane, upgrades will be complimentary of course, and she can fly to Gaza to pick up the Jewish hostages herself. And while she's there, she can chat with the Hamas lads about her utopian vision of the Middle East. The problem is the Hamas version of utopia doesn't include Israel at all, or the LGBTQ community, I might add. To see members of this Labor government condemning the firebombing of the Melbourne Synagogue is like watching arsonists return to the scene of the fire. This government has fanned the flames of anti-Semitism by refusing to recognise it, by refusing to deal with it, by making it sound like for every act of anti-Semitism that they must condemn Islamophobia to provide, balance, and by freelancing at the United Nations with a foreign policy that sends all the wrong signals about what ought and ought not be done. I'm now convinced the only way to end anti-Semitism in this country is to first remove the Albanese government, under whose watch it's been allowed to quite literally burst into flames.